one of the things I say over and over again in the book is that systems like these don't crack down on poor and working people because they are helpless and vulnerable. They crack down on us because we're powerful and scary and we have the numbers.
Welcome back to UVA Data Points. I'm your host, Monica Manning. Today we're bringing you a conversation between Lane Rasberry, the Wikimedia-in-Residence here at UVA School of Data Science, and Virginia Eubanks, an author, journalist, and associate professor of political science at the University of Albany. Recently, Virginia began the PTSD Book Club, an ongoing project that explores books about trauma and its aftermath. You can find this project and Virginia Eubanks' other projects at virginia-eubanks.com. This conversation was recorded back in 2019, and I know, that's so long ago and the world is a completely different place. But before you switch to another show, let me just say, this conversation is extremely relevant to our current moment. In fact, time has only made the conversation more immediate. In many ways, it is a discussion that looks toward the future, warning of the unintended or at times intended consequences of emerging technology. And it's a bit scary how much they got right. And while the conversation lobs some heavy critiques at the tech world, it also provides many reasons for optimism. It's a fascinating and multifaceted discussion. And so with that, here's Lane Rasberry and Virginia Eubanks.
How do you do? My name is Lane Rasberry. I'm Wikimedian-in-Residence here at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. I'm here with our guest today, Virginia Eubanks, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany, State University of New York.
That's right.
Author of the 2011 book, Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age. Co-editor of the 2014 book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith, and author of the 2018 book, Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile Police and Punish the Poor. Virginia?
They're all a mouthful. I'm just realizing.
Wonderful titles, and they all have in common social justice, civic issues. Can you tell me about your field of research and why all this is important to you?
Yeah, so that's a great and difficult place to start. So one of the things I often say about my career as a researcher, a writer, as a sometimes academic, sometimes journalist, is that my colleagues and my teachers have always said that I'm very difficult to discipline, meaning that I've always been very sort of interdisciplinary in the way that I look at work. Where all of the sort of interest in this comes from is that I was a welfare rights organizer for 15 years. And much of the work that I have ended up writing about over the last 20 or so years of my life comes from doing originally a long project of participatory action research with a group of women, a group of 90 poor and working class women who lived in a residential YWCA in my hometown of Troy, New York. And so many of the things that I've ended up following are questions that we sort of developed together in our time doing sort of activism and participatory research and organizing. So largely I just sort of followed where my neighbors and friends and colleagues led. And I feel just incredibly lucky to, I think, keep hitting on some really interesting questions about the relationship between technology and social justice and economic inequality in the United States.
Certainly not everybody in social justice is participating in new technology in the way that you do. I find that rather uncommon. To what extent would you call yourself a data scientist or technologist?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So I started in this, so I sort of came of age as an activist in the Bay Area in San Francisco and Santa Cruz in the mid-90s. And this is, I'm going to date myself very terribly right now. Now everyone will know exactly how old I am. I started out in this field as a contracted HTML programmer for CNET magazine.
Oh, that's great.
In like 1995. Maybe. So I had an interview with them that literally involved the question, do you use ordered lists or unordered lists? And this was like a very difficult technical question at the time. And I could also make a living doing this as a contractor. So I worked for CNET and a number of other places. But I was also an economic justice organizer. And it was a really complicated, interesting, troubling time to live in the Bay Area. So on one hand, I would hang out with the friends that I met doing tech work as a contractor, and folks would have sort of only half joking ask if, had you made your first $1 million yet? Like there's this very hard push. But on the other hand, at the same time, I was watching things like public housing disappear in San Francisco, and the city was visibly whitening over the time that I lived there. And so it was really troubling to me that there was this dialogue about how everyone was going to make $1 million. And also we were going to solve all of the world's social justice problems. And yet at the same time, the reality that was happening outside everybody's windows was just being completely ignored. And so it really sort of forced me to a kind of crisis of consciousness. And I actually sort of fled the Bay Area and moved to this small town in upstate New York, small city in upstate New York, where I've lived the last 22 years, thinking like, whew, now I've escaped that. And the year I moved, they sort of rolled out a regional economic development plan, not surprisingly for the time. This is now 1997, called Tech. Oh, what was it? I think it was called, it was called Tech Valley. And all the same narratives and all the same talk was happening. And so that's really where I started to think, okay, like, let's figure out what's happening here about this story. And that's when I started doing the work that I talked about earlier with the women at the YWCA, because I really wanted to get a sense from them. How are you experiencing this supposedly new world of technology? How is it really affecting your lives? How's it affecting the services you get from the government? How's it affecting your neighborhoods? And how can we think about it better together? So yeah, I mean, that's a long answer, but I started out as a technologist. I still keep my hand in to a certain degree, but I fundamentally think about myself as someone who really cares a lot about the relationship between technology and social justice and the reality of people's lived lives.
That's very fortunate that you were in these hot places in their boom times and got to see these from different perspectives. Yeah. Yes. Can you say something about the usefulness of being interested in technology and journalism and social issues, and how these knowledge of any one of these can make someone better at practicing a career in any of the others?
Yeah, so I think we tend to ask that question when we're assuming that the sort of priority skills there are the tech skills, right? Like,
it often happens.
Yeah, it's so important that for example, how the inside of machine learning works before you can say have any kind of meaningful critique, say, of algorithmic decision making. Mm-hmm. I'll say in my own work that I don't find that to be true. One is that I find people in community who are seeing these tools be rolled out, who often see themselves as targets mm-hmm. of these tools, actually know a lot about them. And they may not know like what the difference between an outcome variable and a predictive variable is, or why it's important to know the weights, or like the difference between a stepwise probit regression and, random forest. Yeah. Yes. See, I wrote a book about it. But they know a lot about the history of the use of their data in the past. Yeah. They have really good guesses about what's happening now. Mm-hmm. And often they have a lot more information about how the technology is likely to interact mm-hmm. with their community in terms of really important things like power and privilege and money. So, yeah, I do. I think it's important to have a set of lenses to look at this stuff from. But I also sometimes feel like from the tech side, there's often a kind of math washing that happens, which is like, we're going to throw this sparkle dust at this new policy, and don't look too closely at the cloud of sparkle dust. Because like one of the things I saw over and over again in my research for automating inequality is people would say that the systems were sort of algorithmic end to end, and over again I'd find that like one part of the algorithm was like a guy sitting in a room, like poking buttons, right? That there was often a human in the loop, even when these tools were as sort of advertised as
entirely
fully
automated, but there was a human
systems.
making decisions still in the chain. Huh?
And there's been some great work actually around that by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri, a fantastic book that came out this year called Ghost Work, which is about the sort of oxymorons of automation's last mile, meaning the sort of invisible human work that often goes into making technology systems seem smarter than they actually are. It's a great book. Everybody should read it.
Tell me some more about these people who are the subject or the targets of this automation. So you've got this book, Automating Inequality. You present 3 case studies in here: homeless services in Los Angeles, in Pennsylvania, child protection, and then Indiana, health benefits. So there's these 3 systems. One might expect that these are 3 different sets of expertise, and that these systems shouldn't have anything in common. But you made a comparison both about the systems and the people who are affected by these systems. Yeah. What do these have in common, and who are these people, and what's the common thread here?
Yeah, so I was really lucky how incredibly courageous the people who talked with me on record, right, using their real names, their real locations, their real experiences, particularly the folks who were currently in the public assistance system in some way, either receiving Medicaid or trying to access homeless services, or currently like a parent who's currently interacting with child protective services, they made themselves really vulnerable going on record with their stories. They took a really big risk sharing their stories, and they did so really in the hope that their stories would help other people. And so I'm really honored and really privileged to have been able to talk to all the folks I did. I did over 100 interviews for this book. And though I talked to people like really across a wide array of positions, right? I talked to people who are building the tools. I talked to administrators of programs. I talked to policymakers. I talked to legal aid lawyers. But in every place that I worked, I started the story from the point of view of people who see themselves as targets of these systems. Because I feel like, particularly when we talk about things like algorithmic bias or about some of the human challenges of artificial intelligence and machine learning in public policy, we rarely hear from the people who are really in the trenches right now, particularly around programs like public services that are, I talk about them in the book as being kind of low rights environments where it's people are often facing decisions whether or not to share their information with the state under conditions that could be said to be sort of officially voluntary, but not really consensual. Because if you refuse to give the state your social security number or other information, you can't access public services. If you don't access food stamps for your family, you don't have enough money to afford to feed your kids, then you open yourself up to a child protective investigation, potentially losing your kid to foster care. So while you can say, well, people signed an informed consent about giving their data to the state, it's hard to say it's truly consensual or truly voluntary. And I'm really interested in the way these tools work as mechanisms of social control. And that's why I was really interested in looking at the public service system. I think there's a lot of great work out there about these kinds of tools in criminal justice. And I actually think there are really important parallels. But I've seen less work around these tools being used specifically in environments where they are aimed at shaping the lives of poor and working people in this country. And so that's really why I wanted to do those 3 different areas, is that they tend to be programs that are targeted at our poorest, most vulnerable, and also working class families. So different programs, right? So public assistance in one place, homeless services in another, child protective in another, in 3 different places like Indiana, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. But a lot of very similar experiences, a lot of very similar challenges, and I think some similar solutions as well.
How similar were all these systems before the advent of automation?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the things that's really difficult about studying these systems in the United States is that most public service systems are federally funded or federally and state funded, but locally run. So it's not just that homeless services is different than public assistance is different than child protective services. It's it's called Children, Youth, and Family Services in Allegheny County is different than Child Protective Services or ACS in New York City, which is different than upstate New York, which is different than Mendocino.
Despite them all being federally funded.
It's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, despite that, most of the funding comes from the federal government of federal and state. There is a huge degree of local control over the programs. And there's good reason for that, which is we should be responsive to local conditions.
And is that?
But it makes it hard to study.
Okay. So that's certainly must have been the way it was before the digital age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to what extent is advent of new technology keeping the differences of local culture?
Yeah.
And to what extent is it making everything more similar?
Yeah. So one of the places that came up really specifically was in Indiana.
Okay.
So the system that I looked at in Indiana was this attempt in 2006 to automate all of the eligibility processes for the state's Medicaid program, which is the health insurance program for poor and working class people,
Sure.
Cash assistance, and what was at the time called food stamps and is now called SNAP,
Yes.
or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So this was a program that basically looked to consolidate the jobs of about 1,500 local county-based welfare caseworkers who in the past sort of accepted applications, often developed relationships with families over time, and helped them sort of navigate through a really complicated and difficult system. So this plan automated the eligibility process, sort of took the application online, and also moved these 1,500 caseworkers into privately run and regionalized call centers. So one of the things that happened, one of the things I heard from caseworkers there, was that in moving from what was a family-based system or a case-based system in the past to the technologically facilitated system, which was known as the task-based system, really changed the nature of their work. So where before they were responsible for and responsive to a caseload of families,
Yes.
now they responded only to tasks that were assigned to them in a computerized queue.
So excuse me, but
yeah.
so before with these caseworkers, would they actually speak with the families, or and
Often,
they would also pull the same family's file repeatedly over time,
Often, yeah.
and be familiar with that.
Yeah.
And what's the situation after?
So the situation after is basically all the caseworkers were moved to a centralized sort of regional call center that was often 50 or 100 miles away from the place that they lived. And rather than developing a relationship with a set of families over time, they just responded to whatever task dropped into their queue on this sort of workflow management system. And so one of the real concerns that caseworkers had to this question about changing the local nature of the job is that say somebody was applying for food stamps. It looked like they weren't going to be eligible.
Yes.
In the past, the caseworker could say, oh, hey, looks like you're not going to be eligible, but there's a food pantry in your town, right? It's open Tuesday nights.
Mm-hmm.
You should go down and you should try early in the month because late in the month they run out of food, right? So they have that kind of local knowledge about the place that they live. And after the change, this was one of the major changes for caseworkers, is that they felt like their sort of knowledge, their expertise was no longer useful in the system. And it had really profound impacts on the families who were trying to access the system. So in the first 3 years of this experiment of automating the eligibility system, the state denied over 1 million applications for public assistance. It was a 54% increase from the 3 years before the automation plan. And it had really profound effects on families, including one of the stories I tell in the book is the story of Omega Young, who was an African-American woman from Evansville who missed a phone appointment to recertify for Medicaid, tried to call her local caseworker to let her know that she couldn't be at this telephone appointment because she was currently in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. Despite her attempts to reach out and to tell people why she couldn't make the appointment, the new automated system, because she didn't make that appointment, said that she had failed to cooperate in establishing eligibility for the program and kicked her off Medicaid as she lay in the hospital dying from ovarian cancer. So she actually died March 1st, 2009. And the very next day, she won an appeal of her denial, and all of her benefits were restored the day after she died.
So she lost her human advocate. She was having her case negotiated by a machine, such as it is, or a process.
Exactly. And it meant she lost like free transportation to medical appointments. It means she was in danger of being evicted from her house, like all this while she was trying to stay as healthy as possible through the last years of her life. Her family is really clear that they don't blame the state for her death. But it is really clear that she suffered needlessly in the last several years of her life fighting the system.
You were generous or optimistic, saying that when these caseworkers moved to the call center, they were taken from their local community and moved 50 to 100 miles away to a call center. Is there any effort or any reason to believe that these task centers pull people from local communities, perhaps to advocate for the local communities? Or
yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't ask anyone that specifically, but I did talk to some folks who had been caseworkers for a really long time, 25, 30 years by the time I talked to them, and had weathered the change, like had gone through this process.
So being retrained to use this automated system,
leaving
their old skill set behind?
Yeah, I mean, what they would tell me is that it felt like one of them, Jane Porter Gresham, said, I'm a social worker because I care about people, basically. And she said, if I had wanted to work in a factory, I would have worked in a factory, right? And what I felt like I was doing after the automated system was trying to sort of fit widgets into this box. Yeah. And everyone who comes to you when you are working in public services, working in public assistance, come to you because they suffered some kind of trauma. They've, there's been a fire, they've lost a job, someone's gotten sick. Right? Like something really fairly awful has happened in their life to drive them.
Because these are hard jobs that take talented people and don't pay a lot.
Yeah.
So you have to have a reason to want to be there.
Yeah. And she said that really what she felt is before the automation, that her job was about like looking people in the eye and letting them know that it can get better. And that was the thing that drove her out of the profession. She basically retired after the automation. She sort of,
because
she told me she tried to hold in as long as possible, but in the end it was really affecting her health and she ended up retiring.
You started this book with quite a long historical narrative, the history of social welfare, activism, labor movements. And I took that to be an unusual place to start. I hadn't
My
seen
editor thought so too.
All right, I was going to ask you, how original was that idea? Do you have any reason to believe that anyone who was designing these automated systems was looking to the precedent of other interventions? in their design of these new systems?
Well, this is the moment that I always thank my wonderful editor at St. Martin's, Elizabeth Disgard, because originally the book started with a 93-page history of the last 400 years of poverty policy. And she was like, oh, Virginia, please, God, don't do that to them, please. And so she encouraged me to get it down to a svelte little, like 25 pages of history. But I actually think that history is really important because we have this way to think about new technical systems, kind of like the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like it just comes from space,
Yes.
but it has no context. It's just lands on a blank slate and changes everything. And that's not the reality of how technology is integrated into society. There is a kind of deep social programming around these systems. And that deep social programming, I think of as sort of the legacy programming of these new systems. It runs underneath the actual programming of these systems, often in ways that are unacknowledged. And that's the thing. I don't think there's anything necessarily dangerous about technology per se. What I do think is dangerous is that technology is, in the cases that I look at, particularly in public assistance systems or public service systems, is politics pretending it's not politics. And that's what's dangerous about it. What's dangerous is this idea that these tools are fundamentally neutral, that that neutrality is actually what we want, like as a value, and that efficiency and cost savings are like our most speed. Integration are our most important values, like rather than values like self-determination, dignity, fairness, equity. And so the reason I started the book with a history of the poorhouse in the United States is because the poorhouse informs all the decisions we make in public policy today, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so I use in the book, I use this metaphor of the digital poorhouse to talk about these algorithmic tools and predictive models and machine learning and artificial intelligence as being part of that history. So the way I talk about the tools in public services is often they're much more evolution than revolution. And in order to make better decisions about how we build these technological systems, we have to understand that history. And so I'm sitting in Charlottesville, Virginia right now. You have in Charlottesville, Virginia, a street called Poorhouse Road. And the reason you have a street called Poorhouse Road is that's where the Albemarle County Poorhouse was. And this is the weird way I get to know all new towns I go to, which is the first thing I do is look up where your poorhouse was. And often try to go visit. And I often leave flowers in tribute because many poorhouses had unmarked graveyards. So there's still graveyards of generations of poor and working people. I believe now where your poorhouse was is now a country club, but I have not confirmed that yet. So give me till tomorrow and I'll let you know for sure. Wait, I wrote it down.
Goodness.
The Glenmore Country Club. So the original poorhouse that was called the Albemarle Inn, and it was 2 miles east of the Keswick Depot. So I don't know where the Keswick Depot is, but I'm going to find out. As of 1899, they had 43 inmates. Most of these were built in the 1840s and lasted. The one in my hometown was standing until 1956.
Inmates is the appropriate term for the residents?
That's what they called them. Yeah,
I see.
That's what they called them, was inmates.
I see. You've talked about the human connection in these systems, the importance of keeping the people from the local communities with the local knowledge involved in all these new interventions and new technologies. And you've said how the history of previous human efforts evolves into whatever the new technology is. You seem to have struck a chord with many media outlets. So for your book, Unmeting Inequality, magazine Slate, The Atlantic, The Jacobin have interviewed you. You've given interviews to them. Yeah. Commercial companies, unusually, asking for your interview, EdSurge and Sumo Logic. Yeah. Open Mind on City University New York television. You've presented at different universities, Berkeley Klein at Harvard, Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford, given interviews for them as well. And on different radio shows, NPR's All Things Considered, The Majority Report with Sam Sater, and This Is Hell for WNUR in Illinois. You've had quite a tour with this book.
Yeah.
And I find that unusual and exceptional. Why do you think so many media outlets are interested in this story that you have to tell?
Yeah, so I think we're in the middle, like people are now talking about this moment that we're in as sort of the tech backlash. And I'm not sure that that's a fair way to describe the moment we're in. But what I can say about the chord that the book struck was I feel like the book came out at exactly the same moment where people who did not have a lot of direct experience with these systems, particularly in public services, started to get really anxious about their own interactions with tech, with data-based decision-making systems in their daily lives. So
you're talking about the actual workers who are using these
no,
systems,
I'm actually talking more about sort of the wider professional middle class sort of reading and worrying public, right? Who all of a sudden are like, wait, what is Facebook doing with my data?
Yeah, okay.
And one of the things that I was really interested in doing was sharing these stories from people who have been dealing with these kinds of data extraction and invasion of their privacy and exploitation of their labor through sort of technological means for really 20, 30, 40 years at this point. There's a lot of wisdom there. And there's also a lot of suffering that needs to be addressed. So one of the stories I tell at the very beginning of the book is about a woman I worked with. This is back in 2000 now. Who was part of a team of folks who co-designed a tech lab with me at this YWCA in my hometown. And one day we were sort of sitting around just sort of talking, sort of shooting the breeze about technology. And this was right after electronic benefits transfer cards, EBT cards, came out. And they're like ATM-like cards that states increasingly have been loading public benefits on. So if you get cash assistance or SNAP, those benefits will go on this card rather than being in like paper stamps. And so we were talking about EBT cards, and I asked her, so it's like, Dorothy, like, what do you think about yours? It's pretty new. And she said, there's some things that are better about it. It's a little bit more convenient, maybe, right? Maybe there's a little less stigma when you use it in the grocery store. She said, but one of the things that really bothers me is that my caseworker, because it's a digital card, can call up a list of every place that I've been, like every place that I've spent money. And so I'll go in to talk to my caseworker and she'll say to me, for example, like, why are you spending all your grocery money at the corner store? Don't you know that going to the grocery store is more is less expensive? And I must have had this like really sort of shocked look on my face that this is something that she was having to deal with, because she kind of like grabbed my knee and laughed at me for like a solid 2 minutes for being naive. And then she got a little quieter and she looked at me and she said, like, oh, Virginia, you all, meaning sort of professional middle class people, you all should pay attention to what's happening to us because they're coming for you next. And I really feel like that moment in a lot of ways was the moment that I really started to do this work in earnest. Not because I was concerned with warning middle-class people about what was coming, but because I realized how different people's experience with these systems are depending on their relationship to sort of larger patterns of power and privilege. And it's not just poor and working class families who face this kind of interaction with the tools of sort of the digital revolution. Migrants, communities of color, people who live in public housing, right? Any place where there's low expectation that people's rights will be respected are places where the government and private entities experiment on vulnerable populations with sort of new tools. And this, again, goes in very, very far back in history, all the way back to the sort of anti-grave robbing laws that said that medical schools couldn't hire people to steal middle-class corpses from graveyards But what the state would do instead is give them for free bodies from poorhouse graveyards, right? So we see this moment over and over again where poor and working class people are seen as experimental populations in ways that might even push science forward, but do so at an enormous cost to people who aren't always seen as an important part of the story.
There's quite a few worrying stories in this book. You've been around, talked with a lot of people at this point. I want to ask you about two responses. One, what do you think of the narrative in your book? Is it hopeful, scary, neutral information? So I'd like for you to critique your own book.
It is not neutral information.
All right.
I mean, I'm a neutral reporter.
Yes, okay.
As a reporter, it was actually one of the things that was really important to me was to find, to not go after the worst case scenario stories at all.
Okay.
And while, I mean, Indiana's not a great story. Like that might be a black hat story, but in both Los Angeles and in Allegheny County, the tools that I talk about there, coordinated entry in LA and the Allegheny family screening tool in Allegheny County, are some of the best tools we have, not some of the scariest. So by best, I mean, that the designers have often done everything that progressive critics of algorithmic decision-making have asked them to do. They've been largely transparent about what's inside their models or their tools. They've put the tools in public agencies, so there's some kind of accountability, democratic accountability around the tools. And in some cases, they've even used some degree of sort of participatory design with people using the tools to develop them in a way that's sort of fair and thoughtful and takes lots of different people's knowledge into account. And I did that on purpose because I think it's quite easy to sort of like pick 3 case studies and that are just shooting fish in a barrel. And it'd be really easy to write a simply a story that, or a set of stories that just make people paranoid. And that was not my intention at all. And I don't think that's what the book does. I think what the book does is raise really important questions about the social justice issues at the heart of the kinds of technological decision-making we're making around economic inequality today, and bring the voices and the critiques of those people who are really facing the pointiest end of the automation stick into public dialogue. So I don't think that I'm at all sort of selling fear in the book, so much as acknowledging that there are some really tough experiences and some really smart critiques from people who see themselves as targets of these systems. I think overall that the story that the book tells, while not necessarily easily optimistic, is a rousing one, right? One of the things I say over and over again in the book is that systems like these don't crack down on poor and working people because they are helpless and vulnerable. They crack down on us because we're powerful and scary and we have the numbers. And it's an attempt at control. And you can see that if you look at the history, that the tools of social control of poor and working people change at the moments when we are feeling our power. So I actually think the story is quite, if not optimistic, hopeful, rousing, and it connects these issues to other kinds of social issues that movements are organizing around in ways that I think are really meaningful for how we move forward.
I'm glad that you felt a rousing public response. I hope that's
where I feel roused by it, but then I'm biased.
Let's talk about how to make people more roused. So we're at a university right now. There's so many faculty and staff here talking to students about predictive analytics and all these issues that you raise. What role do you see for universities to play in this discourse about automation? How do we rouse people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm currently a half-time investigative journalist and half-time in the political science department at SUNY Albany. I feel like it's an enormous privilege to have conversations with young people in classrooms and other places on campus. I feel like universities have extraordinary resources for having conversations, but also just like in terms of actual resources, sort of hold on to a lot of the tools, a lot of the finances, sometimes networks that are meaningful for this kind of work. I think what I've learned after being in a university, so are we going to include grad school? If we're including grad school, being in universities on and off for 22 years, is that the fatal flaw of universities getting involved in this kind of work is that they come in thinking they hold all the expertise, and that what they're doing is charity, is giving kindly of themselves and their resources to, like, for example, the communities in which they're situated. And I think that is enormously dangerous, and a way to really reproduce these kinds of problems rather than really interrupt them. So I think universities need to come at this with a kind of modesty that acknowledges that we have very specialized and important expertise, but it is only one form of expertise. And often we make really big mistakes when we move into doing work that has really profound, direct, concrete impacts on the ways people keep their families safe and healthy, or fail to. And so we really need to learn from the people who are most affected. We really need to learn to produce structures that force us to share power even when it's uncomfortable, including things like power over research questions. That was one of the biggest challenges for me as a graduate student when I first started doing participatory action research.
You've mentioned that several times, participatory action, the importance of it and everything.
Yeah, so it was important to me, like, and it's not a specific method at all. You can do any kind of research method in a participatory action research with a participatory action research orientation. The thing that is different about it is you're doing research with communities rather than on them. And that actually means some really challenging things for academics, including things like giving up a certain degree of control of your research agenda. So instead of saying, which is what I did when I first started doing it, going into a community and saying, I'm here to help, right? Like, the problem is the digital divide, so let's build technology resources. This is basically what I did at the Y. And 2 years into this project, bless them, the ladies of the Y sat me down and they were like, Virginia, we love you. We think you're really sweet, but all of your questions are stupid and have nothing to do with our lives. And it was just such an incredibly generous thing for them to do. And it totally shifted the way I do this work. That I realized I was coming into the work with preconceived notions about what people's problems were that wasn't their interpretation of what their problems were. And that I needed to enter the space with more humility, more modesty, and really be willing, able, and excited to learn from folks who had experiences I didn't have. And so, in the long run, I think that's one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me was the intervention from the women at the Y. Yeah.
I'd like to describe a situation for you, and I wish you could respond and tell me is this an accurate modeling, and then I've got a question about it. So there's government and corporations who are designing these automated systems. There's the people who are targeted about it. I sort of imagine that universities are kind of a third party in this, and somehow universities could do something to have the corporations or government shift some of the power or control to the people who are targeted about this.
Yeah.
Is that a role that universities could play? And if so, what's an obvious way that universities could help transfer power?
Well, so I'd love to see that. I mean, what I mostly see right now is the opposite, which is that academics are producing these tools for the state.
I see.
And then often spinning them off into entrepreneurial endeavors that become private companies. So if you look at predpol, for example, or other kinds of predictive policing technologies that was produced at UCLA or USC. I don't remember which. Sorry. It's either
I know the
USC or
organization.
UCLA.
Yes.
All right. And then spun off into
a company, a very big one. Yes.
Yeah, a private entity. So I would love to say that academics, are on the side of targets of these tools, but often we're not. And I think that there are really smart, really well-intentioned people working in the space of producing technologies for the state and doing great work around that. But there's equal numbers of folks who maybe don't know as much about the policy area and the history of the policy area and power as they should. And then they're walking into situations and then they're surprised when their work is used against what they think the original intention was. And so one of the things I talk about a lot when I talk about the book is like, how do we build these tools in ways that sort of harden their ethics so that they can't be used against their original intention? I'm not sure that that's possible. And I've found many of the folks working and many of the academics working in this space haven't thought a lot about that. I actually asked the academic team that produced the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. I asked them directly, so right now this tool produces a score that basically scores every family with a number from 0 to 20 that says how high a risk they are for abusing or neglecting their children. And everybody right now, the administration and the designers of the tool say, we'd never use this to take kids out of their families. We're only using it to make sure that they get extra resources if they need them.
What happens in practice?
And I asked, so right now, largely people trust this administration and the community is sort of given the administration the flexibility to sort of experiment with this. But what happens if you get a new administration in who is not oriented towards the community in that way? And I asked the academics, in that case, what would you do? And I remember they told me, oh, well, in that case, we try to put something in our contract that says if they use our tool against the intention that we really wanted it to be used for, then we'd have the right to say something about that. And I was like, but that actually doesn't seem like actually building a lever in where we can say look, this is not acceptable. Using this now to risk rate every family in the county and to pull kids out and put them in foster care is unacceptable. And is there some way we can install kill switches in these things?
Very interesting.
Right? So they can't be used in ways that we find personally morally reprehensible. And that's not something we're thinking about as much as we should be.
All right. So that's a good description of the university relationship. Mm-hmm. Something perhaps long-term, the way the universities relate to communities over the long term. Yeah. So shorter-term intervention that universities have, we continually get students in and send them out into the workplace. Yeah. We're a school of data science. Yeah. What kind of skills or conversations should we be having with these students who are not part of academia and who are going to go out into the world? Yeah, so it's so interesting. I speak a lot to groups of students who are in data science. Yeah. And I definitely, when I do lectures, pretty much the first or second question I always get asked is basically a way of phrasing, give us a 5-point plan for not doing the things you're talking about in the book. And I always say, I wish I could. I wish I could give you a 5-point plan that's here's how you protect against this happening. But the reality is, the systems that I'm describing, the technical tweaks to the systems I'm describing, the systems have existed for a really long time. And they're really deeply embedded in our culture and our politics. And they're going to be really hard to shift. And if we are trying to push the world towards social and economic justice, that is long-term, long-haul work. So data scientists who care about social justice are a special kind of unicorn that I'm always looking to find ways to wrap them in bubble wrap and protect them because it's such an incredibly important set of skills. Yes. But an equally important set of skills and knowledge is
really knowing about the people your tools are most likely to impact. So if you're working on a tool that is going to be used in homeless services, like, you best go out and meet some unhoused people. And that's on us as people who work in the field to really know enough to be able to predict what might happen with our tools before we engage in that work. And I know that's actually a really high ethical bar to set for folks. But I also think, given the world we live in, that it's a really necessary one.
All right. I want to ask you a critical question.
Sure.
So there's this ongoing conversation about, should we be more bold in automating more systems, or should we be more hesitant?
Right.
So you answer the question in different ways, but I wonder, in all your research, can you tell me what evidence gaps do you see that people make arguments on shaky evidence in one direction or shaky evidence in another? What kind of information do you wish existed, or do you find to be absent?
Oh, that's great. I mean, there are some examples of folks who are actually doing, like, the data work to fill some of those really important gaps.
Yes.
I don't know that I'm going to come up with the name of this project off the top of my head. But some folks who are related to Data for Black Lives, for example, have been compiling officer-involved shooting data.
Yes.
Nationwide.
Yes.
And that's just, like, a hugely important data need.
Yeah.
So those kinds of projects are happening, and I think are really important. The other thing that I often say, and I think is really crucial, is, like, if we have all the sort of data scientists and technologists we need to build systems like the ones I talk about in the book that divert people from public assistance, then we have all the data scientists and information we need to actually reach out to people who are eligible for public assistance and are not getting it, in order to facilitate them getting public assistance. So in some states, so it's only, like, the receipt rate for something like cash assistance is like 7%. So, like, 93% of people who are eligible for cash assistance in Indiana don't get it. So again, but that's a political change. Like, we currently can't do that. There are some states you can't even advertise that food stamps exist, because the states are so focused on diverting people from programs rather than bringing them in, that they think advertising a program would be a failure of the program, because people would then use it.
So wait, let me ask you. There's all these systems which help screen people who are accessing public benefits. And you're saying that the tendency of these systems is to divert people away or to deny access. Can you tell me about the systems that are being designed and where the investment is going to make systems which recruit people into public benefits? Are you saying that these?
Yeah, so I'm saying that those don't really exist yet.
Okay.
Although there are, I'm saying that basically we have the expertise and the information to do that right now, and we're choosing not to.
I see.
That's not true across the board. There is, like, for example, a really great organization in Chicago called M Relief, lowercase m, like mobile relief.
Okay.
And one of the things that M Relief does that's really amazing is, so one of the scariest things for my family about applying for food stamps is that, particularly when you apply online in the state of New York, there's like 20 different screens that ask really, really pretty intense questions about your family and your life. And you have to fill out every bit before you sort of hit the arrow to go to the next page. And then after you've answered questions that are like, seem pretty crazy. How many refrigerators do you have in your house? Like, tell us, like, how you prepare food. Do you prepare food together? Do you, like, all of this really pretty intense information about your family. At the end, there's basically just a button that says go. And that button releases all that information to the state before you even know whether you're going to be eligible for the program or not. So it's just, you're just taking a dice roll. Like, you're just like, okay, I hope you use this the way you say you're going to use it and you're not doing anything else with it. And I hope I'm going to be eligible for this program. But at the point you hit the big button, like, you don't know either of those things.
So much vulnerability and so much commitment for people to get
it's a lot of trust.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of trust. And most people wouldn't do it if they had any other option. So what M Relief does, which is so interesting, among the things, they do lots of different things, but one of the things they do is help people get on SNAP, on food stamps. CalFresh specifically, is California's version of food stamps. And one of the things they do is they actually have you apply through their app. They hold the data and keep it anonymous. They ping the system to see if you're going to be eligible. If you're going to be eligible, they then turn around and say, okay, it looks like you're going to be eligible. Do you want us to release your information? So it's like they do a lot of other things, but that's like one very simple change that is actually really profound, because what it does is give self-determination back to people who often feel like they're in a situation where they don't have a choice about what they do with their family's information. And I think that's super crucial, particularly because these are political systems. And as political systems, they are teaching people what government is. And if what government is this like enormous, terrifying data vacuum cleaner, that's not how we want people to think about government. And that's not how we want government to sort of operate, is as this sort of frightening, life-changing, privacy-invading system. So, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to think about doing this work better. I think the primary one is because of the basic inalienable right to dignity of all human beings. And organizations like MRelief, I think, do a great job at bringing basic values like dignity and justice back into the work.
All right. So about dignity and justice, we've talked so much about automating inequality. I wanted to ask you about another one of your books. Yay. Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. So this was an activist. Could you tell me about her and why you're interested in this person?
Well, so Barbara Smith is this extraordinary individual. She was one of the original members of the Combahee River Collective, which was this amazing collective of Black feminists in the late 60s and early 70s, started out in Boston. And they're famous for producing, well, for a number of things, but among them producing the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was this really clear, beautiful articulation of Black feminism in the early 1970s, where we get, such terms as identity politics and we believe intersectionality, or at least what they called interlocking oppressions. So she's this incredibly profound, brilliant organizer and writer who later, because they decided as women of color writing for their own survival that they needed to control the means of production, later created their own press called Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which published some of the most important books in women of color feminism in the United States, including This Bridge Called My Back. And all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. So she later became an elected politician in Albany, which is near where I live. And is just an absolute sort of hero in local organizing and in my life as a welfare rights organizer. I came into contact with her quite a lot in Albany. And basically the story is when Barbara Smith asks you if you want to do something for her, you say yes. But my colleague Alethea Jones and I produced this book that we think of as a sort of mixed up reader that sort of raises some really important questions about how to do social justice organizing through her life, through the stories of her life. So it really starts with her civil rights organizing in the 50s and 60s, all the way through her work as an elected official in the 2000s. And it creates this kind of conversation between early writings of hers, writing about her, movement ephemera like buttons and flyers, and also sort of historical organizing material in ways that help us think through how to do multiracial feminist organizing attuned to class now. And it's been really great to watch how this sort of really incredible moment in racial justice organizing has been able to reconnect with Barbara's work, not just because of our book, but with that book as one of the resources. So yeah, she's just this extraordinary woman. And it was such an incredible opportunity to learn from her about organizing and about living a life with integrity. And she still lives in Albany and she's still organizing. And I believe she's 76 now. And she's just still a hero.
That's great. Can you tell me something about, especially you put so much emphasis on what you did in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. How can that inform anyone who's working in new technology today, or to what extent is that possible?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the fundamental, one of the most important, so many important things, but one of the most important things that come out of that tradition is the idea of intersectionality, the idea that, and identity politics. So though identity politics has been given a bad name by folks who have a sort of, I think, really flat interpretation of what identity is. One of the things that was amazing about Combahee was as the way they thought about identity politics is just saying, like, as generally Black women, many of whom were lesbians, and many of whom were working class, we have a right to organize based on our own experiences and not to try to fit ourselves into anything else that doesn't fit us. And actually, not only does that make space for us, but that produces a better politics because we live at so many intersections of oppression that freeing, say, working class Black lesbians means freeing pretty much everyone else, because you have to address patriarchy, racism, classism, and capitalism, and a number of other things in order to free us. And so sometimes people interpret that as a sort of oppression Olympics, like you win the more oppressed you get, but that was never the intention. The intention was to say that we all live in a web of social relationships and power relationships, where there are parts of us that carry privilege, and that there are both benefits and problems that come with that. And there are parts of us that carry oppression, and there are both benefits and problems that come with that. And understanding ourselves better and understanding those intersections that we inhabit better means that we're going to be better at politics, and we're going to actually be better at building coalition with other people. It's not about, because Barbara would say, like, how limited my politics would be if I only cared about those who look just like me. And that was never the intention of intersectionality or identity politics. It was always about multi-issue politics. It was always about building coalition. And I think that matters not just for organizing, but for doing this kind of work in technology as well. Understanding things like how power works are really important to that work.
That's very inspiring. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh, I love Barbara Smith. She's amazing. Everyone should immediately look her up.
You've got another book that I'd like to mention, Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age, that you wrote in 2011.
Yeah, way back in the day.
I'd like to ask you what changes you've observed, because there's some similarity between the theme of that book and the theme of your 2018 book.
Yeah.
First, could you summarize what this book was about?
Yeah.
And then could you tell me, what have you observed as a significant change in that time?
Yeah, so Digital Dead End was the book about the work I did with the community of women at the YWCA, this 5 years participatory action research that I did there. And it has sort of three halves, if I can say that. So the first half is what I think about as sort of the real world of information technology. So that was really about the conversations that I had with women who lived in the community about how these ideas about high-tech development were affecting their experiences and sort of their day-to-day lives. So how does it affect sort of regional employment prospects? Like, how does it affect your interaction with technology in the systems you come into contact with in your day-to-day life? And one of the key insights there was that conversation I had where they sort of corrected me, not about the EBT specifically, but about sort of the way I was framing questions.
Your survey questions.
Yeah. So they, one of the lessons they offered in that work was that the problem was not that they lacked access to technology in any kind of simple way. And in fact, that technology was really ubiquitous in their life. But the kinds of interactions that they were having with it tended to be exploitative and demeaning. So they were coming into contact, or disciplinary. So they were coming into contact with these technologies in the the high tech, low wage workforce, in the criminal justice system and in the public assistance system. And so the first half of the book sort of talks about that. The second half of the book then says, like, okay, if the given is that folks are having these often very difficult interactions with technology in their day-to-day lives, how do we think about sort of critical technology education in a way that takes that as a starting point rather than ignoring that reality? And so the second half of the book talks about sort of what we came up with, what we call popular technology, which is a way for people to come together and to talk about their interactions with technology in sort of a critical, thoughtful, and productive way, a way that was oriented towards justice. And then the third half, the reason I call it a third half is because there's a huge appendix on the end of that book that basically just gives a ton of documentation of the kind of work we did. So meeting minutes and popular education exercises and all sorts of stuff that give everybody the resources they need to do the work for themselves in their own communities.
I wish more people would publish those kind of supplementary.
I loved that. It's like a 60-page appendix, and I think I shouldn't say this, but I think it's the best part of the book because it gives you this incredible flavor of like what that work felt like. And I think what's so important to take from that, even though we were dealing with often some very difficult situations and some folks really struggling to meet their basic needs, like we took so much joy in the work that we did, and we all learned so much from each other, and it was so inspiring to do the work. And so part of the point of sharing that material is to inspire people to like not just see this as like, oh, we have justice, like, oh, we have to pay attention to justice, so hard. It'd be so much easier if we didn't have to think about this stuff. The reality is like the work itself is hard, is challenging, is crucial, but it's also amazing. The company's really good. I have become so much less cynical a person and so much more optimistic a person since doing this work, just because I see people who really are facing incredibly difficult situations in their lives and nevertheless do collective work oriented towards liberation with just humor and generosity and courage. And I just feel so privileged to be able to do it.
Incorporating it in their day-to-day lives. It's not something that's added onto their work duties. It's completely a part of their routine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Can you say something about the mood of technology or these kind of interventions in 2011 versus 2018? Should I even be asking you?
That's a really interesting, that's a great question. Yeah, so I actually feel like I've been doing this work for a long time. So I feel like this is in some ways the work that I left the Bay Area to try to figure out. And I certainly haven't figured it all out. But I mean, I think one of the things I see that is really inspiring is that increasingly social justice movements, whatever their other areas of sort of focus and interest are, like whether it's racial justice, whether it's LGBTQI work, whether it's feminism, whether it's labor, I feel like so many movements are also thinking about the way these tools impact their work. And they're thinking about it in such interesting, such meaningful, such important ways, right? Like, Edward Snowden did not discover digital surveillance, right? Like that has a long racial history in the United States. It has a long class history in the United States. And this work has been going on for a really long time. One of the things that I think is so interesting about these tools, about these technology tools, is that they make those relationships so concrete that they can offer really powerful points for organizing around, because they make the social and power relationships so visible. And so I think there's a lot of that work happening now in a way that it felt very inchoate back in 2011. It felt like we were really interested in figuring out this work, and other people were interested in it as well, but we didn't quite have the language to talk to each other yet, and we weren't really sharing experiences in that way yet. And I think that's really different today. Just last week, I was talking to the president of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and they've been fighting against this system that's called robo-debt there, that basically has been trying to collect money from folks who were supposedly overpaid public benefits in the past. He's talking about, creating basically worldwide unions of the unemployed, but organizing around these kinds of tools. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights just in October produced an amazing report about the relationship between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and sort of the digital welfare state. That I think is going to be an incredible resource for organizing. I feel like the conversation is so much more sophisticated than it was a couple of years ago. I feel like the way people are thinking about resistance and self-defense is really different than it was a couple of years ago. I feel really excited about the way these conversations are going.
I appreciate the positive attitude you've had about everything we've discussed this evening. Is there anything that I've failed to ask you that I should ask you, or anything more that you'd like to say about any of this?
No, I just want to reaffirm how important it was that the folks I spoke to, the families I spoke to who are targets of these systems and automating inequality, what an incredible risk it was, and how grateful I am that they trusted me with their stories. It's an incredible mitzvah, it's an incredible gift of generosity and kindness that they agreed to make themselves more vulnerable so that other folks would feel less alone. And so I just always try to reaffirm their incredible generosity when I'm talking about the book.
It's like you said, you have some rousing ideas that inspire people and make them dream of a better world.
I hope
and
so.
Make them enact it.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thanks for speaking with me.
Yeah, it was great. Appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out this month's episode. We'll be back in March to bring you another conversation. In the meantime, if you haven't already, check out season 1 of UVA Data Points. We're currently working on the second season, so keep an eye out for an announcement about this later in the year. Also, if you like the podcast, let us know. Give us a rating and review. If you need to contact us, send us an email at uvadatapoints@virginia.edu. We'll see you next time.